Okay, welcome everyone to the lecture video for week 3. So this week we're talking about evaluating sources, citations, documenting sources, and then we're also talking about essay 81 and 88. And we'll get to that here in a little bit. So at this point in time, as we briefly discussed in the intro video, your proposal is due this week. And then next week, we're getting into annotated bibliography, which means we're starting to do real research. So this is our first step into real research, not baby research, not that intro level research, not that we're just testing to get a couple things. No, this is where we're starting to get into the more deeper, serious pieces. So, first and foremost, playing off a little bit of what we talked about in last week's discussion and lecture, there are, there are different types of sources. There are print sources, there are digital sources, there are multimedia sources, and there are people. I want to emphasize, I'm not saying that these are the only types of sources, but these are the 4 larger categories of sources that we find. So print sources are anything that's physically been printed in a book, a magazine, a newspaper, whatever that might be. These are those physical things that you can look at and hold in your hands and see with your own eyes. Digital sources are just that. They're found through the computer, through cyberspace, things like that. It's important to note that, especially now in our modern era, that digital sources they tend to be the primary. And where there are still print sources, a lot of those also offer digital versions. And so it's important to note that in the early days of citation, so for some of you who might be in your 30s or late 20s, you might remember when you were learning how to cite sources. If you do remember this, awesome. If not, that's okay. But one of the things that we talked about is, where was that source originally? Was it posted in a physical print media? Even if you found it online, if it was originally printed, you would choose it would be a print source. Nowadays, it's a lot more of a blended kind of category, so it's not that distinct. So very specifically, we use print media as a resource. When we refer to it, we mean something that can be physically found in a book, in a newspaper, something that you can physically hold, that you do not print off from a web page, something that has a physical hard copy. Some professors in different areas, and not just necessarily here at EC3, but at any school, some professors will get really specific and want you to have physical print media as your sources. That's the way the cookie crumbles. You can't control what other professors want. However, what I will say that's important about this is, for our purposes in this class, you do not need to use only print, and if you are struggling to get print sources, that's okay. You can use digital sources. Like I said, modern technology and the way things are printed now, a majority of things are available digitally, and that's okay. So I don't want you to feel like you can't use it or whatever. This is the 21st century. We're in 2025. Digital is a valid type of source, and it's important to understand how we evaluate those things. And we'll talk about that here in a little bit. But I wanted to at least get this kind of out there. Multimedia sources are just that. They're not quite digital. They're not quite print. They're something else. They're multi-formatted. They can be found in different ways. When we talk about multimedia, we traditionally mean things like films, things like songs, art, pictures, etc. Multimedia is the things that you would not classify as a print source, but you also wouldn't count it as a digital source. Not that it doesn't provide information, not that you can't find it physically printed or digitally online. It is just a different type of source. A multimedia source is a source that is not a physical written piece available in hard copy or digital. for our purposes, that's what you need to know about multimedia. Multimedia is pictures, songs, movies, etc. Okay. The last type of source that I want to talk about is people. And I kind of teased this a little bit when I talked about surveys and things like that. And I purposely brushed over it quickly. So here's where I say people are valid options for research. They are types of sources that can be used. We talk about, in particular, I know our history class here at EC3 talks about primary and secondary sources. It's important to note that a person is a primary source unless they are someone who has witnessed something and they are retelling the story from someone who told them, which then is a secondary source. But the point is, people are valid sources. If for your project you want to talk to people, like conduct a survey, that is a source. If you want to interview someone, that is a source. And there are ways and rules about doing those. So these are our 4 larger categories for types of sources. Like I said, this doesn't cover every single particular example, and while we will talk about some specifics of citation here in a little bit, I don't want you to get bogged down with the specifics. We will talk about it. There will be a video that looks specifically at it, especially when we talk next week about annotated bibliography. Hear me when I say this. This lesson now, this lecture right now, is the introduction to this. We're mainly talking about evaluating sources for quality, and we're talking about how we do that process. Next week, when we talk about the annotated bibliography, we will specifically talk about proper citation. Okay? So we'll talk about it this week, but the focus will be next week on that. Okay? I wanted to get out of the way first. All right. So I do want to talk about online sources. Specifically, here in the United States, most websites that you can find on the internet have one of these endings to it: a .com, a .edu, a .net, a .gov, or a .org. If you see something that is different, like a 2-letter after it, that is a country code, which is a slight difference to this. It's still can fall under a .com or .edu or etc., but it might have a country code at the end. So FR is France, EU is England, EU is European Union, UK is the United Kingdom, which is Great Britain and whatnot. IR or IE? I think IR is Ireland. Anyway, not super important to know those, but it is important to note that there are differences. So why do I even talk about .com, .edu, .net, .gov, and .org? Well, this is where I'm going to tell you right now, not every professor sees it the same way as I do, and it gets into a debate, and that's not the purpose. I don't want you to get into the debate, but I'm simply explaining to you why we need to talk about these. So, .com stands for commercial, which means somebody paid for the rights to use that domain, and the typically primary goal of a .com is for commercial purposes. It's to make money. So, oftentimes, some professors will say, you can't use .coms because they're unreliable. While, yes, there are a lot more unreliable .coms than there are reputable, there are still legitimate reasons to use a .com. In my class, you are free to use a .com. You are free to use any of these types of sources, any types of these online web pages. As long as it serves the purpose towards actually answering your questions and actually helping your research, it is valid. But I'm telling you that some professors, not just here at EC3, but anywhere, might have issue with a .com because its purpose is to make money, not for research, not for education, not for specifically sharing information. Okay? Now, that gets into .edu, which stands for education. .edus tend to be harder to get. It's not something that just anyone can get. Notice if you go to our website, it's ec3pa.org. Eventually, we should change to an edu at some point, but it has to do with the process of being recognized by an accredited body and by the Department of Education. It's a whole complicated matter. But EDUs are for schools. And so that means a lot of times, if it's from research from like faculty at a institution or student research, you can halfway trust that information because at the very least it was done with the purpose of academics, with the purpose of educating. So a .edu is a fairly reliable source for a lot of academic type work. Okay? .net is for a network. These are another thing. They're not like .com, but they are easily available. So a .net doesn't necessarily mean that it is a more valid resource. It just means that that web page is part of a larger network, a larger web of web pages. They're interconnected part of usually a similar organization. .gov. I'm saying this very specifically. Almost always, .gov is the most up-to-date information that is publicly available. Things like cdc.gov tend to have the most up-to-date CDC information, which includes research. In this current administration, there is a issue of all the information on a .gov page because they have there's been huge sweeping cuts to staff that we've seen courtesy of the Department of Government Efficiency. We've also seen certain websites have to remove references to DEI and things like that. So right now, .govs are not 100% accurate, but traditionally they tend to be up there with .edu for reliable information. Typically. Okay? And then this gets to our last one, which is .org, which is organization. And these typically tend to be for nonprofits, but they can be for other organizations as well. So I would say this very specifically. .com, .net, and .org are all typically seen as less than perfect by some people. I would say you just have to be very particular about looking at the content and verifying it. .edu, .gov, typically it has been verified by somebody else, which gives it a little bit more credibility. Like I said before, feel free to use any of them in my class. Just know that you might have a professor in another class some point in your college experience that says you can't use a certain type of online source. You might not be able to use a certain source from the previous page, like one of these types. That is the preference of the professor, and that is, unfortunately, their right in the classroom. Like I said, have at it. Use whatever you can. And so, with this, I want to talk about crap. Yes. CRAAP. Our textbook talks about it in particular, and I do want to dig into it. But before I dig into it, I want to say this. This right here, this crap method, the way of... this is analyzing. This is evaluating sources. And what this actually is critical thinking. This is the skill that seems to be not really taught and missing in a lot of places. And I will tell you right now, this is the type of thing that jobs actually want. People who are looking to hire people say they want people who are critical thinkers. And when I talk about jobs, I mean in the non-straight labor industry. And by that, I also mean like fast food and whatnot. People that are hiring, more than just intro-level jobs. They're looking for people who are critical thinkers, who are self-motivators, and those are some of the qualities that we want to make sure that you have. So this is important. Please. I know it's silly because I say it's crap, but this is an important skill to work on. So, the CRAP method is a way to evaluate any source. This can be an actual website. This can be a book. This can be an article. This can be a blog. This can be anything you want it to be. Because what this is a way for you to evaluate any source you're looking at and see if it is legitimate and if it is worth your time. So, CRAP stands for currency, relevance, authority, accuracy, and purpose. Pretty straightforward. So, currency as part of CRAP means how current or timely is this information being presented. Are you reading an article from 5 years ago, or are you reading something from 30 years ago? If you're reading something from 30 years ago, how relevant is it to what you're talking about? If you're reading an article that's only 6 months and it's talking about a problem that's 10, 15 years old, why? What is the relevance to it? Why? How timely is it? And relevance we're going to get to in a slightly second difference. But that's currency. How current, how timely is it? When we talk about relevance here, we mean the importance to your reader. How important is this piece to your research? Any resource you look, you should ask that question. How important is this to my research? If it's helpful to establish your background, okay, that's valid. If it's important to help explain some difficult concepts, okay, that's valid. If it's to provide some quotes and figures to help drive your point home, okay, valid. If you picked it because it just looks cool, that's not really important. What is going to be important to your argument? What is going to be important for your reader to know? That's relevancy. Authority is the credibility of the source. Is this source credible? And I need to emphasize this. If you cannot tell if the author is credible or the source of this information is credible, look them up. I know, I'm asking you to do research on your research. And yeah, that is a legitimate and important aspect of doing real research. Because here's the reality. Anybody can say anything. And with the internet, anybody could say it from anywhere in the world and don't need any kind of authority to say so. So what gives that person the authority to say it? You need to be able to look for credibility. If you can't verify someone's credibility, you might still be able to use it, but you need to be careful because it might not be valid. Which comes to that next point, accuracy. Is the reliability and truthfulness of the information there? Is this real, or is this just something somebody came up with? Is this something that can be proven? Is this something that actually has sources? This is where I say Wikipedia is fantastic. There are footnotes that lead to links that you can verify the information from. That gives it truthfulness and reliability. This is accuracy. This is why I said this is a skill that is severely lacking in the workforce, and that's why lots of different businesses have said we want people who are critical thinkers. Because they just accept the bottom line and they don't dig any deeper. They want people to look deeper, to be able to answer why. And then the last part of CRAP is purpose. What is the reason that this piece of information exists? If you are if you're using information from a documentary, you should be able to tell me what is the purpose of that documentary. Was it to shine light on a particular thing? Was it meant to be a hit piece, a smear piece? Was it meant to be enlightening on a particular subject? What was the purpose for its existence? And if you are paying very close attention, you'll notice I put kairos, ethos, logos, and topic down here. We'll talk about topic in just a second, but kairos, ethos, and logos, those are the rhetorical appeals. Those are important things that we talk about in English Comp 1. And now I say topic. For those of you who have had me for English Comp 1, this should be familiar. For those of you who've not had me, we will do a little talk on it in a separate lecture, but topic is part of the rhetorical situation. It stands for topic, angle, purpose, audience, and context. These are the 5 important aspects of the rhetorical situation with the rhetorical appeals, logos, ethos, pathos, and kairos, that group together to do a critical analysis. So, again, critical thinking, this is an important aspect of it. And so, one thing that I say is important is you need to develop your research muscles, because research is not easy. Now, I know some of you definitely are worried now because I said research is not easy. Deep research is not easy. It is a skill that you have to practice and get better at. There are definitely going to be times, some of you may already be really good, almost expert level researchers. And if you are, that's awesome. I will not take that away from you. But not everybody is. Research is not always easy. And if you've never done it before and you don't really have an interest in it, it's harder and harder to do. So, let me tell you this. If you are one of those people that have never really done research before and you struggle with research, start developing your research muscles. And to do this, ask lots of questions. And I mean that. Ask questions of every source you look at, of any type of information you gather. Ask questions. Be cautious and suspicious. I'm not saying don't trust anything ever, but anytime something seems not almost too good to be true, be cautious and be suspicious. Because that's going to be a super helpful aspect of this. Honestly, this is something that even people who do research now should also work on, is learn to skim or speed read for something worthy of a deep read. Let me save you like 3 hours of your life in this class. Do not read everything. At least don't read everything fully. Everything that you read is your time. I know not everybody in this class has a bunch of free time. Some of you have families you're taking care of. Some of you are working more than one job. Don't waste your time. And like I said, I say this to everyone. No matter how good you are at research, I will always tell you, skim everything to find out what is worthy of a deep read. And then, of course, last but certainly not least, don't be afraid to ask for help. Especially as you're learning, it's going to be a struggle. Ask for help, and yeah. So, let's talk about citation, documenting sources. So, like I said before, we're not going to talk super deep on citations. That's something we're going to talk about next week. Okay? But I do want to talk about the basics of documenting sources, because I want you to be familiar with it, so when we do talk about it next week and go super deep in depth on it, you're not completely confused. So, format, style, and use. These are the 3 ways that we talk about citations and documenting sources. So formatting, there are rules. Yes, this is exactly how I want to say it. I'll be honest, I was thinking about it and I wasn't sure how, but this is what I want to say. There are rules for using information that is not yours. And so I do want to say real quickly, for anybody who has any type of education that is not from the United States, so you got an education from anywhere else in the world, in some countries there are different rules for information that you pulled from another source. I'm not saying that those are wrong. Those are their rules. Here in the United States, we have certain rules to follow for any type of information that you get from another source. If you take information and don't provide a citation, a document that says that, hey, I got this from here, it is considered cheating. It's called plagiarism. So, the format guide is all it is. It's the rules. It's the rules for how you cite information. The style is the specifics of how they want things to look, and the use is how you do it, and which, again, is mostly here in the United States to avoid plagiarism. So, before we get to the two middle bullets, I want to jump to the Modern Language Association and the American Psychological Association. These are the two primary citation styles that are used in college writing. MLA, the Modern Language Association, is one of the most common, and the second most common is the APA, the American Psychological Association. There's also Chicago, there's Turabian, there is AMA, which is the American Medical Association. There are bunches of different citation ways. For our purposes in this class, you can do either MLA or APA. It doesn't matter to me. We will talk about both of them. But now I want to talk about in-text citations and end-text citations. So, here's the important piece about avoiding plagiarism that any student who is worried about getting in trouble for accidentally cheating, hear me when I say this, there is such a thing as accidental plagiarism. If you do accidental plagiarism here in my class, I will simply draw your attention to it and you will not be in trouble. If I fear that you are intentionally doing it, that is a problem. We will discuss it and it will go in a different direction. But the best way to avoid any type of plagiarism is with an in-text citation and an end-text citation. In-text citation literally is in the text. When you mention the information in your writing, there's a handy little in parentheses way to put a citation in your text that immediately helps to avoid any type of plagiarism. And in most cases, it's the author's last name. You put it in parentheses, and if it has a page number, you put page numbers on it, and boom, you've avoided plagiarism in one way. That's an in-text citation. It's meant to immediately draw attention to where the information came from. The end-text citation, much like footnotes on Wikipedia, is the longer information at the end of the entire thing that you're writing that has more information so that somebody else can look at that and follow and find the same piece of information that you did. That's what an end text is for, is to allow your reader to find the very same information that you pulled for your research. Okay? That's the purpose of in-text and end-text. It's to avoid plagiarism, and it's to create a quick reference for where somebody can find information. That's it. It is a serious offense in higher academia here in the United States, so it's important that you avoid these things. And that's why I said we will talk more next week about the citation thing, but this is part of that very early intro stuff. Which, let's go to the whiteboard. And so this is where I will say this is an actual digital whiteboard on the next slide that I have used in a previous class. Instead of doing it live with all of, well, not with all of you, but instead of doing it live and taking the time to write it out, I simply reused this whiteboard for you. So here is the whiteboard. And we will look at this again when we talk about citations next week, because we talk about in-text and end-text citation and the simple rules for it in both MLA and APA. So remember, MLA is Modern Language Association. APA is American Psychological Association. Notice, if it's got the red text, it's MLA. If it's blue text, it's got APA. If it's black, both follow the rules. So they're the same. And the first thing you should notice here is most of it is black, which means both MLA and APA follow almost the same formatting. There's just a couple little differences, okay? So let's talk about in-text real quick. So we have author's last name, page numbers, which I mentioned, and in APA, we include the year published. That's it. That's the in-text citation. Some people put a web URL and put all that text. You don't need it. Author's last name, year published, and page numbers. That's it. That's max what you need in an in-text citation. And they're quick references. Like I said, their MLA and APA are both almost identical. Both need author's last name and page numbers if it's there. Only APA requires the year published. So if you are ever panicking about an in-text citation, don't. Put the author's last name and put page numbers if it has it. If it doesn't have page numbers, we figure something else out. So I'm telling you right now, don't panic about it. If you've worried about in-text citations later on, don't. It's easy. We will talk about it. And I even give an example. According to Smith, the size of the sun is far greater than the earth. Please note, the period that would have been at the end of the quote is actually outside of the parentheses. Nope, it goes all the way in. I know that seems weird. No. Scratch that. Ignore me. Other way around. It doesn't go in there. It goes at the end of the parentheses. But notice, the parentheses are there. However, this is a weird oddity of English. If you reference the author and there is no page numbers at the beginning of a quote, you do not need an in-text citation or an in-text citation for it, because you referencing the author and the year often is almost always enough to count as an in-text citation. So if you're always saying according to and you give the actual author, you can avoid the parentheses. But if not, parentheses are real easy. And I even have in a second one. In Is This Necessary? The author states, sometimes we make mistakes and worry about everything. Smith, 2019, page 42, end quote. That's how to do it. It's super easy. This is why I said in-text citation you should not ever worry about, because that's the easy one. End-text is the one that gets complicated. So hear me as I say this, and I'm gonna repeat it again, so those of you who hate repetition, you're gonna get used to it next week. Always, 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 author's last name. In-text citation, always, 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 author's last name. Full stop. If you remember that, you will avoid most cases of plagiarism. Okay? Okay. Let's talk about end-text citations. What sort of information is needed at the end text? And this is what I'm going to tell you. What's in black is the typical things that we see, which is author's name, title, where you got the information, demographic information, the organization or source where produced, what journal or volume, issue, number, etc., year published, last updated, page numbers, date accessed, and type of source. Those are the common pieces of end-text citation. And this is why I said I understand that it gets complicated. I understand that this is the part that people who say I don't like citation, this is what they're referring to. It's not always the in-text, it's this. And it is. It's complicated. So please, look here. I give you an example, simple way of remembering how to do a citation. Last name, comma, first name, title of work, publisher, year, demographic information, page numbers, URL, or DOI. That's it. APA. Last name, first initial, date published / updated, goes at the beginning instead of towards the end. Title of the work, publisher, demographic information, page numbers, URL, DOI. Notice, they're almost the same. This is why I said don't panic about this. This is not as complicated as it needs to be. Now, I will say I put in green type of source and date accessed. Proper MLA and APA both have rules on this. For my purposes in this class, I do not care when you access the source, and I don't care to know if it's a print source or a digital source or anything like that. That doesn't matter to me. What matters to me is that you are finding good, reliable sources. So that, for me in this class, you do not need to worry about. The one thing that is true, though, is all your citations need to be in alphabetical order. Okay? So, there is two other things that I need to talk about because they come up when we talk about citation. It's ellipses and block quotes. Ellipses are meant to incorporate the idea that you are cutting some of the content of a quote out. So I start with the information, ... said the author, comma, ... and completed it later. Or you could do, I start with the information, ... and completed it later. So our reader knows that there is a gap between that starting part and the ending part. There's more information that the original author said that's not included here. That is the way to use an ellipses in a quote. Okay? And a block quote is when you want to cite a lot of information from the author, but you want to not summarize it. You want to keep it all together. And there's special formatting. You write your paragraph like normal, but then you put a colon. And then after a colon, the quote itself is then formatted so that all the information looks like this, with the quote being indented ½ an inch, no quotation marks, and the quote is more than 3 or 4 lines of text, period, with your in-text citation at the end of that. Then you continue your paragraph previously as normal. You don't have to use block quotes, you don't have to use ellipses, but if you do, these are the proper ways to do so in MLA and APA. Like I said, we will talk more about the specifics of citation. We will come back to this and then some next lecture when we talk about the annotated bibliography. So, let's transition and talk about our essays. So essay 81 was the HIV capital of small town America. And these are the questions that I ask you, but hopefully, you can answer these yourself. But one thing I do want to get into is, I don't want to necessarily go what is happening in this article, because hopefully you read it and we're talking about how a particular part of America, a small community, ended up having a large rate of HIV positive cases due to needle exchanging from heroin use and things like that. So, hopefully you're able to read that and see that. But there's two terms that comes up from it, which is syndemics and ethnography. And that's what I want to focus on. So syndemic is the idea that there are interrelated concepts that help and work together, not always positively, but they do interact with each other and they have an impact on the environment and the well-being of a group. And then there's ethnography. And this is where I say, if you've never heard this term before, this is a place to learn that. Ethnography is a particular type of learning. It's a study. It's the study of ethnic groups as well as social groups and things like that. Ethnography is a type of research that looks at social groups And you can do ethnographic studies on entire populations of people and how they react to certain stimuli, events, and things like that within their own environment. And so the reason I want to talk about those is because realistically, some of you, and I say your as in you students, some of your research might be ethnographic in design. It might be looking at how a group of people interact. It might be looking at how a culture forms around a concept, a person, an idea, whatever that might be. So I want to say, hey, look, here's a actual article. Here is a reading that I made you read for this class that talks about ethnography, and itself is an ethnography, and this is a good way to get an idea of how that looks in practice. Like I said, and it's the why was this reading relevant. This is why I tell you, all the readings that we do are important. Even if we don't talk in depth about the essays, even if we don't talk in depth about some of the particular reading parts of the chapter, etc., it doesn't mean they're not important. It just means that there are other things that we need to focus on that traditionally we need to focus just more on. This article is not necessarily super relevant and important to everyone, but it is helpful to some people who are trying to figure out how they're going to do their own research, how they're going to do their own essay. So this is a way to see what an official, professional ethnographic research study looks like. And so, Love, Words, and the Brain, this essay really dives into the psychology of things. And honestly, I'm going to tell you right now, the whole reason why I actually, other than the fact that I really like this article, I share it with you all because sometimes students get worried about what they can cover, what kind of content they can talk about, the way they can engage with it. Can it be super scientific but also relatable, which this is fairly scientific but is also super relatable. Like, you can do things like this. And so, in case you hadn't heard of the term ambivalence before, ambivalence is the state of having mixed feelings or contradictory ideas about something or someone. I just thought it was really interesting. I really like the non-conscious feelings and responses because this is something that everybody has had. Everybody has non-conscious feelings and responses. It's why sometimes when an English teacher says, hey, who's excited about writing? And half the class groans. Why do you have that response? And when you ask students, they have to think about it, and sometimes they go, well, I had a really bad teacher. Yeah. Sometimes it's less that you hate it and more that you're ambivalent towards it. Sometimes you actually do have negative emotions connected to some type of, whether it be significant trauma or minor trauma, you might have some trauma related to a teacher. This is the reality. And so I encourage people to read articles that might not be something you've ever been exposed to, but also I want you to see that, you know, you can tackle different subjects. You can tackle the stupid way that our brains work and how we respond to words. Guess what? This also includes interviews in it. So this is like, when I say research, this is what research looks like. So, thank you, ladies and gentlemen. That is it for this lecture here. I do want to say just briefly, like I said, we will talk more about citations next week when we talk about the annotated bibliography. Your focus this week should be getting your proposal done. Next week, when we talk about the annotated bibliography, you can all stress email me and say, Mr. Wheaton, I need help with my citations, and we will talk about it, okay? But, that being said, thank you very much. I hope you have a wonderful day, and I will see you in the next video.